Hello and welcome to the next episode of Have We Thought This Through? This is the series where I'm exploring different ways that humans think, and today's episode, I think appropriately, is all about thinking about the future. I don't know about you, I sit here in February 2025 very much pondering what the future holds, and I just thought it'd be a good moment to consider our different options when we're thinking about the future. So I'm going to break this into sort of four areas. The first one I'm going to start with is this idea of forecasting. We all know it, we love it, it's part of our lives, and it's very much generally based on data, models, prediction, probability, computation. As our data sets have got richer and our computational power has increased, there are a number of phenomena which we're now theoretically much better at forecasting, and we try to apply this forecasting obviously to things like the weather. You know, we're so used to that now, it's got really just embedded into our lives that potentially a 7-day forecast could be pretty much bang on. But we're also forecasting financial markets, and we're trying to forecast political outcomes. All of these things tend to be based on big data sets that we can grapple with and find patterns in with computation and look at what the future of those phenomena are within a pretty narrow range of time. The interesting thing about forecasting is if we think of that, and I'm going to put this within the context of an object that is called the future cone, then that idea of like the most likely outcome, the forecasted outcome, lies right in the middle. But the challenge is it doesn't go very far out in time. It's often quite a short walk into the future. But let's look at the next one. Let's call this scenarios development. And this is the idea that the future is an unknown space with a whole set of possibilities within it. And it's not our job to work out the one thing that's going to happen. It's our job to imagine all the possible things about to happen. And that's a very interesting and different kind of act. It's a creative act. Now, it still very much is likely to use data and insights and trend analysis across a whole number of different dimensions. But the job here now is to create a whole number of different divergent scenarios that help us anticipate a whole bunch of ways in which things are going to turn out in the future. You see this often used in, for example, military war games and, big global strategizing. Those teams will develop a whole range of different scenarios, really different to each other, in order to then test whether the present, if we look at the present in relationship to those future scenarios, where we feel like we can anticipate those futures and be prepared for them. In other words, scenarios development is almost a way to come back to the present and consider our readiness for a range of different future possibilities. A highly creative act. And in the futures cone, I would say it moves us out into a kind of a wider zone beyond that middle layer, thin layer that we were doing with forecasting. It gets us into the probable and the possible. And it widens the range from it's going to be this way to it's going to be potentially all these different ways. What about backcasting? So backcasting is an interesting one in that commonly backcasting is used to imagine an ideal future and to really try and get the details of that worked out. So for example, we might be trying to imagine a better system in the future. Let's just imagine a better water system. This is something the UK government did a little while ago. They imagined a better water system in the future, and then they backcasted. So what they did is they tried to work out what would be the conditions that would lead towards this ideal outcome. And this is a really good way to create a kind of break in the thinking, in a break in the continuity and the norms of the present. With this approach, what we do is we imagine that better future, and then we work out the kind of systemic shifts and changes that are required to make that future possible. Backcasting. So my fourth one is this idea of speculative futures. And in many ways, this sort of relates to that concept of scenarios that I was talking about earlier. But the key thing I think around speculative futures that I like is that they're kind of tiny little snapshots. They're very much kind of woven and created. They can have, you might tell that speculative future through the eyes of a particular group of people doing certain kinds of interactions, living their lives, interacting with objects and systems, doing certain kinds of verbs in new ways. And the idea is that we really want to kind of allow ourselves to create a rich description of these futures. We want them to be speculative, we want them to touch on each other. So we might create, 4 or 5 different speculative futures. And we're not being quite as hardcore in regards to the scenario planning from earlier, where we're using that to anticipate the future. What we're doing instead is trying to sort of feel the future. We're trying to get a sense of the impact of the future on people's lives and their interactions, their emotions, their relationships with things and people. And then we might look at what the enabling factors are for those speculative futures, and moving way beyond the probable or the possible. We might even be getting into the preposterous zone. Who is to say, right? But nothing is off the table. Because in imagining those wild speculative futures, we may uncover specific ideas, specific interactions, specific possibilities that we simply couldn't do with a more narrowly defined scenarios thinking or our idealistic backcasting approach. Now, all of these processes of thinking about the future can be diminished by a bunch of very natural things. So for example, the concept of groupthink, the fact that there are certain fashionable ideas that very much grab hold of us and we find it difficult to let go of. There is the concept of the Overton window, which is really the kind of narrow space that is kind of plausible for a mainstream population to think about or to agree on. There's if we think about how societies transform over, let's say 100 or 200 years, there's enormous change takes place. A policy around equality in one era would simply be unthinkable to a mainstream population. And 100 years later, it's now absolutely part of the Overton window. The key point is when we're imagining the future, we're often stuck in our own Overton window. And we will actually have to imagine a new Overton window for the future. Partly, I think the kind of amelioration or the fight back around this is what Edward de Bono calls depatterning. And that's that kind of idea of breaking the patterns of thinking that we have very naturally, intuitively. Of course we do, otherwise we would stumble to do any kind of speedy thinking. And that's about getting diverse inputs. It's about really getting playful with our language and reframing and messing with our language, making up new words and new concepts and not worrying about that. It's definitely about play and randomness, enabling all kinds of, peculiar combinations of thoughts that perhaps we wouldn't normally have. We have to force those in through playful methodologies. And finally, the whole idea of counter narratives. Every single time we're building a narrative, it's useful to think about what the opposite narrative is, and to keep sort of triangulating a set of counter narratives in relationship to the ones that we're naturally aiming for. So we can use a lot of these techniques to help break us out of our patterned thinking. And finally, what I would just say is it looks like AI could play a really productive role in a number of these areas. Of course, it plays a huge role in forecasting, but let's think about scenario planning, speculative futures, backcasting. One of the things I think that we can do with our large language models is we can kind of ask it to come up with a lot of different variant ideas on our behalf. You know, sometimes what we'll need to do to create that in the real world with physical living humans is have a lot of different humans all in the same place at the same time, or online, thinking about things in a really well constructed collaborative process. And my goodness, we should be aiming for that, but it is not always possible. Sometimes what we can do is get AI to generate a whole pile of ideas on our behalf, and then we can use those to sort of throw into the hopper. We can think of, when we're thinking of speculative futures, not to get it to imagine those whole futures, but to imagine little components of those futures that then we can add together into larger narratives. I think there's a lot of ways in which we can enhance our human processes with our AI tools. So I just wanted to do a quick romp through some thinking processes, how we imagine the future, and thanks for listening, and hope to see you in the next one.